Hello, my name's Gavin, this is Genre Books, and this is more Rocket Summer Shenanigans. Rocket Summer, the booktube reading event created by Michael K. Vaughan, where we read classic science fiction. During week 2 of Rocket Summer, I started reading a couple of books. I've not yet finished them, but I started the Shaver Mystery Compendium Volume 1, stories from Richard Shaver about Lemuria and Atlantis and all of the weird and wonderful things which I will be rolling into future Project Rabbit Hole videos. I'm also, alongside that, reading War over Lemuria, Richard Shaver, Ray Palmer, and The Strangest Chapter of 1940s Science Fiction, a book by Richard Toronto. And this book starts talking about Ray Palmer, the editor of amazing magazines, and it just led me down a different path of thinking about pulp. I talk about pulp a lot on this channel, but I'm not going to be talking about specific stories today, rather a kind of pulp grudge match. I think this is a story that has it all. It's entitled Fandoms, politically left versus right, New York versus Chicago, super science versus ray guns and monsters, university graduates versus a high school dropout. You might think that pulp fandom or science fiction fandom is a kind of monolithic being. But that's really not the case either now or then. You would think perhaps people would look to find some common ground. Not so much these days. People don't like to look for common ground in anything. But back then, clubbing together, this doesn't happen. This story from the 30s and the 40s is a bit of a salutary lesson. As I'm talking science fiction pulp, the story begins naturally enough with Amazing Stories. This is the granddaddy of all science fiction pulps, and it's a publication that turns 100 years old next year. The editor at its launch, the creator, was Hugo Gernsback. Hugo is Hugo of the Hugo Awards. Very early on in the life of the Amazing Stories pulp, he accepted a submission from a teenage first-time writer, Ray Palmer. And the $40 acceptance check that Gernsback sent to Palmer changed the trajectory of Palmer's life. It also represented one of the few documented times that Gernsback actually paid promptly and in full. Gernsback lost control over Amazing Stories in 1929 because of not being able to do things like pay bills, and he was succeeded briefly by Arthur H. Lynch as editor, and then by T. O'Connor Sloan. Under Sloan's stewardship of the magazine, Amazing Stories published the first story by John W. Campbell. There is no set to, no contretemps yet between Campbell and Palmer. Both Palmer and Campbell have had their debuts in the same magazine, and the premier science fiction magazine of this early science fiction pulp age. But 8 years can be a long time in a publishing industry that moved so quickly. Amazing Stories has its fortunes decline. It performs increasingly poorly in terms of sales from 1930 onwards. By 1938, the circulation of the magazine was down to 15,000, and the publication, along with sister magazines, was sold to the Ziff Davis publishing group. They didn't really want Amazing Stories, they were after the magazine Radio News. But in amongst this tale of perhaps snobbery, we find a nugget of the absolute opposite. Ziff Davis offered the position of editor of Amazing Stories to Roger Sherman Hoare. Hoare was the grandson of a US Attorney General. He was descended from one of the signatories of the American Declaration of Independence. He's Harvard educated. He's a former Massachusetts state senator. But he was also the man behind the pen name Ralph Milne Farley, science fiction author of The Radio Man, The Hidden Universe, and The Omnibus of Time. He declined the editorship of Amazing Stories. Maybe there's a trace there of snobbery, but altruism in recommending his friend Ray Palmer. This was Palmer's first proper editorial job, since he was one of the people behind the influential Midwest fanzine Cosmos. In the interim, John W Campbell's star had risen from that first published story in Amazing Stories. So much so that in 1937, the year before Palmer took control of Amazing Stories, Campbell became the editor of Astounding Stories, one of the many competitor magazines that had sprung up in the intervening years to steal some of Amazing Stories' market share. And here is the schism, one which went through Fandom at the time and the effects of which can still be seen today. Campbell, a former private boarding school pupil, a physics graduate from Duke University, an alumnus, although not a graduate, of MIT. Palmer, involved in a horrific accident at the age of 7, leaving him permanently disabled, often in pain, stunted in growth, forced to leave school before graduation to go out and work to help support his family. These are two editors from radically different backgrounds. Campbell is very much guided by science, or indeed super science, and his editorship of Astounding Stories is commonly seen as heralding the golden age of science fiction. This is the man who wanted to drop the astounding from Astounding Stories because it sounded too sensational. He was very serious about how science fiction should be presented. Palmer is the one-time previous science fiction superfan. Now, as the editor of Amazing Stories, he's a little more jaded and comes into the magazine industry with a very different remit. He is tasked with immediately improving the circulation of Amazing Stories. The new owners are going to give it an issue, 2 issues, and if things don't pick up, the title will cease. And Palmer goes on a very different tack to Campbell. Campbell, as I said, guided by the science, looking for veracity, looking for something which he can hang on to existing technology extrapolated. Palmer, guided by an ethos of, in his words, gimme bang bang. These are perhaps opposing visions, but maybe they are not as clearly delineated as they may first appear. Campbell, with this new golden age of science fiction, brings many new writers to the fore, many of whom have become canonical to our understanding of science fiction of years past. Lester Del Rey, Robert A. Heinlein, Clifford D. Simak, A.E. Van Vogt, Theodore Sturgeon, Isaac Asimov. The Campbell-Asimov relationship is one that is spoken about a fair bit. Campbell was very much seen as a mentor to Asimov, and they had a number of fruitful productions together. What's not as well remembered is that Asimov's first story, Marooned Off Vesta from 1939, was rejected by Campbell for Astounding Stories. It was a kindly rejection, but a rejection nonetheless. Asimov submitted it to Amazing Stories, Ray Palmer accepted it, and therefore, despite Asimov-Campbell relationship being the one that people remember, his first publication came on the say-so of Palmer. The roster of writers at Amazing Stories may be seen as less than canonical. Certainly not as illustrious as we now see the writers who contributed to Astounding Stories. There were a core of writers from before the Golden Age. Stanton A. Koblenz, Ross Racklin, Iando Binder, Raymond Z. Galoon, Edmund Hamilton, Ed Earl Repp. These are not household or even well-known names, but they are writers that I have spoken about before on this channel and writers whom I enjoy. And this list of the older writers was augmented by newer writers: Robert Moore Williams, Chester S. Geyer, Leroy Yerkser, Barclay Livingston, writers who have never made that leap to the canon. I don't want to be taking sides here. I want to nail my colours to both masts. I think everybody has something to offer here. I ought to have a little bit of a fondness for the Palmer approach, and I do, because these uncomplicated, adventure-laden stories are very much a favourite of mine. And that ethos is very much seen in Planet Stories, which is the magazine series. I am doing a deep dive on every single issue. I say that, I'm only 10 issues into the 80 issues that came out, but I will get there. But this love of Palmer's ethos only goes so far. Some of Palmer's writers I don't know, and I haven't read enough or any of yet, so I can't comment on them. And sometimes inviting returnees to the pulps, like he did with Anthony Gilmore, which is a pseudonym for Harry Bates and the man behind some of the worst pulp science fiction stories I've ever read, the Hawk Cass series. These can be bitter pills to swallow when trying to back Palmer's editorship. I also really like Campbell's roster of writers. Those are some quality names there. I just think that maybe choosing one as the canon and ignoring all of the others is a little bit tribal. So, a bitter pill to swallow, as I say, but something which may make that medicine taste sweeter, is that Palmer was also a champion of Ray Bradbury, a writer that John W Campbell had little time for. Whilst I do like, as I've said, the authors in Campbell's stable, I find that his selection process can sometimes be a little bit idiosyncratic. Where he dispensed his merit didn't always match the quality that he was being presented with. Palmer is a much more all-consuming editor. He has fewer filters, or he is looking for something different, he's looking really for the excitement and the adrenaline and the new. I'm making some fairly bold assertions here, and I made some bold assertions at the beginning of the video, what did I mean by left versus right, or New York versus Chicago? What did I mean by Palmer as a super fan or a former super fan? Whilst there are differences between the two magazines' approach, it is notable to see that the legacy of each is based on the enduring opinions of a fairly small coterie of fans at the time. In New York, where Astounding was based, we have the Futurians, and the members of the Futurians are a who's who of science fiction: Asimov, Hannes Bock, Damon Knight, C.M. Kornbluth, Fred Pohl, Judith Merrill, Donald A. Wollheim, James Blish, amongst others. Politically, many of them were on the left. Donald A. Wollheim was attracted by communism. Pohl was actually a member of the party until 1939, and Judith Merrill was a Trotskyist. All these things, of course, up until the Second World War, when everybody's leftist opinions altered with the military rise of the Soviet Union. Amazing Stories, which had by 1938 decamped to Chicago for publication, certainly had a differing makeup in its supporters. But for the birth of modern fandom, it is apposite to note that this really did begin with Gernsback when he was the editor of Amazing. Getting the buy-in from fans, making the fans feel involved in the process, ensured a sort of a regional structure for the word of mouth that Gernsback knew would sell the magazine. And one such regional convener had been Ray Palmer himself, who had his own science fiction fan club, which actually did, even before he received that $40 check from Gernsback, received a $100 check from Gernsback for winning sort of the best fan club in the United States. All of that money ploughed back into the library of the science fiction fan club that Palmer ran. The makeup of fandom in Chicago was possibly a little more apolitical, bordering on small c conservatism. When the second Worldcon was held in Chicago, so this is the beginning of fan conventions, and the second Worldcon in Chicago was the first to have people dress up to attend. The Futurians had planned to attend, and they had planned to attend in order to disrupt the event, but they were instead barred. So, controversy at conventions and the associated awards at conventions is nothing new. These events took place in 1940. Ray Palmer by this point had already fallen out of love with fandom. He had previously befriended, idolized and championed Stanley G. Weinbaum, who a science fiction short story writer and novelist who died very young from cancer. I think he was 35 years old. When that author died, Palmer arranged the publication of a good-looking collection of Weinbaum's short stories, and with his fanzine subscribers behind him, he thought that run of 250 books would sell out. He has an audience here of thousands. He's looking to shift 250 copies of something which is fairly expensively produced. It was far from the case. This did not sell out, and Palmer was left, I think, permanently disenchanted, at least with fandom. Almost from this point on, Palmer goes from pandering to a hardcore of super fans to something more populist, something with more mass appeal. This hardcore of very vociferous fans, I have picked up on it in my deep dive of Planet Stories. The same people seem to be writing letters in. There seemed to be an undue or an outsized influence exerted by these people who are very opinionated. You don't have to do a deep dive of Planet Stories in order to see this in action today. But back to 1940, the sort of rather nebulous battle lines are on display. Astounding with its need for scientific rigour and plausibility, amazing with its more anything goes ethos. Of course, anything goes necessarily means that amazing could encroach upon Astounding's turf, and did any time science fiction in that mould was published or submitted to them. I've no idea whether Palmer and Campbell ever met. I don't know if there was any personal animosity there or whether they were just ploughing their own furrows. But with so many proxies available to them, with their writers, their superfans, and their superfans who are also writers, there was really no need for any communication between the two editors themselves. Astounding could acclaim victory for clinging to that ideal purity of science fiction, and Amazing could point to its subscriber circulation and claim victory on that basis, because the lurid, brash storytelling worked. Fandom may give validation. Fandom may ensure posterity for writers through the canon. Fans will put you in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. But readers buy pulps. The question I'll be tackling once I've read more about it is whether Palmer took this too far when he began printing the Shaver Mysteries. These are tales of Hollow Earth, tales of Atlantis, Lemuria, lost races, basically the stuff that I like looking at when I'm going down into the project rabbit hole. Plenty of amazing stories readers bought into the story as it was being sold to them as true events. Ray Palmer either bought into it himself or was certainly complicit in the myth's perpetuation and perpetration, myth or hoax, depending what you want to call it. And fandom never really forgave Palmer. But then this internal wrangling within science fiction is just that, internal. From an outside perspective, outside science fiction, outside of fandom, the rest of the world, if it even considers pulps or science fiction fans at all, lumps all those readers and fans in together, from the casual buyer to the most ardent superfan. Palmer was certainly traduced over the controversy of the Shaver Mysteries. And should any Astounding Stories reading Campbell devotee golden age of science fiction's superfan crow too much about Shaver, Lemuria, Palmer and hoaxes, it would be wise for them to remember that their champion is the same John W Campbell who in 1950, 18 months or so after the end of the Shaver controversy, first gave space in the pages of Astounding Stories for the science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard to heavily trail his new work, Dianetics, Dianetics, the modern science of mental health. Dianetics being the immediate precursor to Scientology. Anyone criticising Amazing Stories for giving space to something imaginary, a hoax, a hoodwinking, needs to first perhaps look at their home ground. People in glass houses shouldn't be firing cosmic rays. But until next time.